Hello, and welcome to a special edition of Art Talk, which we're calling, for this particular Art Talk after the Art Walk, in honor of the first evening of the Art Walk for this February. We, of course, invite everyone to come in to see the work that we have here at Amherst Media, and however, there are venues which have other unique artwork in them throughout the Amherst area, such as the Amherst Chamber of Commerce, Gallery A3, Hope and Feathers Framing, the Burnett Gallery at the Jones Library, and the Etta Art Gallery. I'm Tom Prutisto. I'm a photographer. I'm an instructor of community Photoshop classes here at Amherst Media. And I was asked by the staff to put together an exhibition of work which would reflect some of what is going on in the classes that we have here at Amherst Media. And so I pulled in some friends of mine that I know are working in the field, and we're calling this show Lens and Keyboard as Palette. Photoshop-inspired images, if you would. And I've asked three artists to join me in this exhibition, one of which, who cannot be here tonight, Ani Rivera, who's part of Community Photo Access, which is a very interesting organization. We're finding a lot of very interesting photography-related artists and community programs that are going on in photography, of which, of course, Amherst Media is one. I'd like to also introduce an associate of mine, Joan Terry. Joan is the Director of Design and Digital Imaging at the Hallmark Institute of Photography. Welcome, Joan. Nice to see you. And her associate, and one of mine, Pete Chilton, also an instructor at the Hallmark Institute of Photography. Welcome, Pete. Thanks for coming down. We have a beautiful exhibition of work that's here up on the walls of Amherst Media. And again, we've called this Lens and Keyboard as Palette. So signifying basically that we're talking about, we're using cameras here to create this art, and we're using computers too at the same time. And that's something that not everybody is familiar with, nor does everybody really like. But Joan, if I could, I'd like to start with you. You've been working in design for a long time. You mentioned earlier that you're actually an art director by trade.
Yeah, that's right.
That's the first thing that you've done. And how long have you been involved with Photoshop as part of that process, would you say?
We were trying to figure that out earlier.
Right.
And it goes back to 2.0. And I was trying to figure out how long that was. You said it was probably 17 years, but I was thinking maybe at least 15.
Photoshop's been around 20 now.
Okay, so it could be like, it could go back to 16, 17 years.
And, but traditionally, that wasn't part of your education that you learned. This is something that you picked up later on.
Right.
And I'm assuming that it has influenced your work in some way. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever thought about how the tools that you use influence what you create?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And is there anything in particular that you can sort of think about when it comes to working with an application like Photoshop that has changed the way you've worked?
Oh, probably compositing, because it seems like I hardly ever take a photo that I don't composite.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as far as putting more than one, one image or more than one image, two or more images together. And collaging. And
that's a regular part of
Yeah, I really didn't do anything. I have a bachelor's in art, and when I was, a student in a fine art program, I didn't even take photography at that point. I took some photography in grad school, but I was a metalsmithing and jewelry design major, and I certainly took painting and drawing and all of that, but I really wasn't into any kind of collage work at that time, but I'm not doing so much in the way of big collages, but I suppose that's the direction I feel like I'm moving towards or would like to do more of.
And so that particular aspect of Photoshop was something that was appealing, that you felt as though you could explore that further. So it was a, how do you say, an inspiration when you found that those tools were available. It led you down a different direction.
Right. I think that combining photography with design, for me, the design aspect of it is still really big. Mm-hmm. And So I think of, when I photograph these days, I often photograph pieces of things. I think of, I don't necessarily think I always have to photograph an image or photograph a scene where the whole scene is necessarily going to be the be-all and end-all for imagery that I create.
So you're
I may
looking
look
for
at perfect-looking leaves or a perfect-looking piece of rust, you know, or
Just
pieces of things. Sometimes, not always.
So that's a direct manifestation of the fact
that's
that
Photoshop.
that you know that you can take these different elements and bring them together
Right.
to create something. So in that respect, Photoshop's kind of a little dream machine in terms of creation, right?
Right, because you don't, it's true, you can look at one unique individual object and look at it and see that it might be lit just right, but yet if you looked at the wider scene, you'd have to deal with much more of a variety of lighting. And that one object might be exactly what you're attracted to anyway. And I find that I look at things like that now because I think of layering, or I think of putting it together with something else.
I think that's very interesting. And we were talking earlier when we were looking at some pieces in the hallway, the fact that the way you approach that creation, how you put pieces together, is different than the way I would take it, and possibly different from the way Pete would take that same bit of inspiration and do something different with it. If we can sort of roll that into some of the images that you have out in the hallway. There's 3 pieces, and they're all of the similar genre that you've put together. And let me just do a little bit of sort of describing of what they are.
Okay.
You call them portraits of neighbors. They were neighbors, and they were portraits originally of these individuals were there. And these were people that they appear more elderly. They're elderly neighbors that you have. And then the scenes that you have them in, how do those elements come into the creation process? Where does that come from for you? They're not in their original scenes.
Right, that's true.
Overall.
They aren't, they were Photoshop composited into new scenes, but those particular scenes that they're occupying now are actually from the same period of time. And, they were photographed during my graduate school years, so if I go way back, it was during the late 70s, and they were all photographed with black and white film. So they're all the color pieces are coming from black and white negatives.
So originally all black and white.
All black and white.
Different backgrounds, different subjects.
Right.
All brought together. So what's the process then of sort of deciding what goes with what? Is there something in particular that you might say these 2 pieces go together?
Well, I think you look for the subject matter that you would like to put together first, and then, in composition, and lighting, whether or not the light is going to work, the light on your subject and the light on your background, how the background is lit, they need to look like they're going to fit, that it's going to be a good fit when you put them together. And certainly for me, composition is a big, huge part of it. And then also the details, the textures, is there enough interest in whatever it is that you're putting together in in this case, the portrait and the background, both of them have to tell a story, have to be visually interesting.
I think they're very interesting. I give them almost a dream-like sort of quality to them, because they don't look like they necessarily belong, but they don't look terribly out of place either.
Right.
Right?
Right, yeah, and there wasn't really an intention to make it look 100% real. I never really worried about that so much. For them to be illustrative was probably more important to me, to look a little bit more illustrative.
And you think that, again, this type of thing, well, let me ask you the question, would you have been able to do this same type of thing without the use of Photoshop, that particular tool?
Probably not, because I probably wouldn't have been able to get, you know, even if I didn't go back to 1970 or whatever, you know, I probably would not be able to take a person who I knew as a neighbor, you know, into an abandoned house, you know, and ask them to give me the time to go sit for a while I was photographing them.
Right.
It'd probably be pretty unlikely.
Okay, great. Pete, let's talk a little bit about the series that you have here. They're panoramas. Let me again sort of describe them. Can you, well, why don't you tell us about this project? How's that?
The 4 images that are here are part of a larger series of 15 different images that I basically gave myself a project and I called it On My Way. And the concept was that from my house to where I work in Turner's Falls, and I live in Greenfield, which is just over 3 miles, I wanted to try to come up with as many different landscape photos as possible in that 3-mile drive, only on the way to work and on the way home from work. So on the same road over and over again. And basically what had happened while I was doing it was I realized that even in that short distance, there was all these different landscapes that were, that I had seen, you know, I had driven, you know, 100 times before, but never noticed it until I gave myself this little project. And I realized that all these little places, these little secret places that exist on the drive were actually really interesting, and you can find like stuff that you might not realize is there, but you just have to really look for it. So that was kind of the project. I took all of the photos are from inside my car, like some were while I was driving, but I don't recommend that, and some were I would stop and pull over and just kind of stand next to the car, but I never went more than, you know, a couple feet away from my car while I was there, just to find those little things. And a lot of them you can't even tell that it was near a road, or it looks like it's in the woods, or so that was kind of the point of it.
Over what period of time was this?
This was over one winter, or about 3 months, 3 or 4 months of time. You know, some you can see snow, and then there's some that you know, there's grass, and spring has sprung in some of them, but it's over that
so
same
at least
kind of,
you have at least 3 seasons occurring throughout that series. And the concept of the panoramas, how did that sort of come into, as opposed to just the straight snapshot for you?
I like that format. I'm really interested in that kind of long periphery, and I guess that's how I see. I don't know if it's because I wear glasses or just the way that you know, I feel like a photograph, like the typical 8x10 or that size, you know, typical size seems more constricted to me, and I really am interested in that periphery that is on either side than, you know, what that original, you know, regular 35mm frame would be. And I did that. I used a digital camera, and I shot multiple photos. Some of them are bigger than others, where, you know, there's multiple shots, 4 or 5 shots. Some are just 2, but it's and then they're stitched together, so it makes a longer image.
That's the Photoshop portion of what that is. Okay, and obviously that it made it possible for you to do this. Prior to, again, having Photoshop, the best thing that you could do, well, the only thing that you could do is you would have a specialty type of camera that was out there, and that was available a while ago. Beyond that, you know, you could put 2 images together side by side, but that's about it. So again, we're talking about expanding sort of, you know, what your capabilities are, right, overall, because you knew that you could do this. And aside from the panorama being a particular kind of format that's there, what I noticed was really interesting about the pieces, as you say, they're sort of photographed many of them from inside of your car. And you can obviously see some of the inside when you're doing it. And what it kind of occurred to me is that we have a limited vision from inside of our car.
Yeah.
You know, and that I'm wondering if that limited vision, looking out your left side, looking out the front, looking out the right, isn't sort of a, you know, a replica of that panorama as you're driving.
Right.
So I really kind of got a sense that I was sitting there in that car,
right,
you know, with you. And
yeah,
seeing
that's what
those
I thought
scenes.
too.
Yeah, the first shot that I took for the series was the one that's here. It looks like it's a windshield basically, but it's covered with the frost that started to form. And I remember just sitting there, and I had thought about what project, and I was like, well, maybe I'll just take some photographs of my way to work. And I had my camera with me, and I was sitting there, and I was too lazy to scrape the windshield, so I was sitting there in the car with the heat on, waiting for the frost to melt away. And I just looked at it, I was like, this is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. Like, so it just started right there, and I just took a photo of that windshield.
And you thought to do the panoramas.
Yeah, and I felt like I couldn't get the whole thing into just that one shot, and so I took the camera and I just shot multiples, and I knew from using Photoshop that I could just, well, I'll just stitch these together.
And this wasn't done with any expensive camera.
No,
right?
It's just with a point and shoot.
Point and shoot camera.
My wife and I bought when we went on our honeymoon, you know, just a normal. I mean, it's a nicer digital camera, but
the fact that you can stitch images together to create something that's really much larger.
You can do it
overall.
you can do it with a cell phone camera now, like as long as you have Photoshop.
I've seen people do that with their cell phones.
Yeah.
So do you think that it was a sort of a conscious thing, that you know, a natural thing for you to work in this format, this wide format?
Not necessarily the wide format. That kind of came with the idea, you know, like you said, like once I was in my car, then everything was
so it grew from there.
That kind of view, you know, everything's a windshield basically. But the idea of using Photoshop, I started manipulating images before I took images. I started with Photoshop 4.0, and I remember in '95, my first year of college, they had one computer and it had Photoshop 4.0 on it, and I would just find images on the internet, which was also new, and would kind of start collaging them together without any thought of the photography part, just I just like the manipulation part of it. And then it just grew from there, and then I started getting more into the photography because I couldn't find the pieces that I want to create the things that I wanted. So then I started taking my own pictures of them.
Right. Again, I find when I understand a tool in Photoshop that I can be inspired to try something that I maybe have not done before. And some of the work that I have here is also a reflection of that. It's feeling that I understand something and it's confidence, so why not push that tool to another level, or or use it in a non-traditional way overall.
Right.
There's an image that I have in the show over here that I call Descending, which is really a single image in itself, but broken up. There's a shape which is taken and repeated a number of times over and over again. And that image basically, again, came out of, well, here's a tool. Here's a selection tool. And let's just see if I take that, select this thing, and begin to repeat this, what ultimately comes out of it. So I find working with it, you know, inspirational. There are a lot of course, very traditional things that you can do with these tools, and that many people do with them overall. But there are also, I think, a lot of creative ways too. Would you say that you're more of a person that enjoys that aspect of Photoshop?
Well, I was never trained traditionally, so I was using the tools to, you know, I would just try a tool. What does that do? Oh, it did this to this one image, so that must mean it does that always. But then you start to branch out and you just try experimenting with different things, and I see that same thing, you know, with experimenting with those tools. You just kind of figure out, oh, this does that or this does that, and how can I take what I've just learned from that and apply it to something else, and I think that is really you know, that playing idea, and then, you know, not only taking, even if someone teaches you traditionally what a tool does, automatically I'm thinking, oh, well, I could use it in this place, or I could use that, or I could do that. So that's the way I think about it, and I think that's just from coming from like no one showing me how to do it correctly. But I think that's what one of the reasons why Photoshop is so powerful is that there really is no correct way. It's just like everyone has their own path and their own method to get to where they want to be, and I think that that's what's really interesting about it.
So I think we have very different interpretations of, you know, of objects. It would be interesting at some point to take the same thing and each of us run it through Photoshop and do what we do with it to, you know, kind of see. That would be a fun little exercise overall.
There's a program out there, I think it might be Adobe sponsored, but they call it like layer tennis, where someone gets an image and does something to it, and they hand off that file to someone else.
Somebody else to see what
and they do something with it, and it comes back and forth, and it
sounds like
might
collaborative
be really
art.
Yeah,
one.
Yeah.
Right?
And sometimes it turns into like a battle, you know, like whose one's better. But I think as an art piece, it's really nice.
When I say the word Photoshop to people, or if I say to people that I teach Photoshop, I always wonder what kind of runs through their heads overall, you know, because there's so many times you hear, oh, this has been Photoshopped, you know, that terminology. I think of that very negatively overall, because that's not the Photoshop that I know from the creative point of view. Right. Of course, it can be abused. But Joan, do you have any advice for people that, creative artists that are thinking about, you know, using Photoshop in their work, you know, ways that or ways of encouragement, or ways that they can bring some of this in? You know, I'm thinking people are afraid almost of getting their hands wet when it comes to a big application like Photoshop. They really want to do some things, but they don't know where to begin. Where's the best place possibly to begin?
Where to begin?
Yeah.
In terms of learning the program, or
well, yeah, learning the program. How would you advise an artist?
Well,
if they were saying, I think I'd like to learn Photoshop.
Well, I think they could start simply with learning the tools and layers, and probably putting together shapes, and it depends on whether they even want to start with actual photographic images or not, because
they may not have to.
You wouldn't even have to. I mean, you could certainly work even without photographs in the beginning.
Right. Just because it's called Photoshop.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean
I mean, well, there are other.
photograph.
You know, there's Illustrator, and that might be a better tool overall if you were going to if you were totally going to illustrate. But if you're an artist and you want to jump into Photoshop and you're not even sure if you're going to be, if photographs are going to be the biggest part of it, you certainly could jump in and start working with color, shapes like the shape tool, and
there really are lots of different
selections
things you can
and layers
potentially do with the application.
It's
overall.
huge, yeah, huge, and just the fact even that you could be, even if you're photographing and you're not into photographing scenes, you can photograph textures, you can photograph all kinds of things that are not normally what you might be thinking about.
So on the one hand, you could have people that want to work with an image that they created with a camera, as far as that goes, and they could manipulate that image. But, and again, your background as an art director and designer, you didn't necessarily start with that material, right? You started with, as you say, color and shapes.
Right.
You know, with basic elements.
You mean as far as
design.
In class, like in school when I started?
Yeah, and in your own work.
Right. Right.
And so the image was something that came in to that part later.
A photographic image.
Photographic
came
image.
Later.
Came
right.
later.
Right. That came later.
And that wasn't the same way necessarily with you, right, Pete?
Right. I was using photographs, but they weren't mine. They were found items. And I still do that sometimes. I do found items, whether it's technically legal or not, I don't know, but still just those found pieces. But I think it's important to have like a good base to start from, though, because it is an enormous program. I don't think you necessarily need formal training, but because it is so big now, it's good to go in with a little bit of knowledge of.
A little bit of knowledge helps you to
like,
just.
What does when we say layers, what do we mean? When we say selections, what do we mean? Like those are the selections, layers, masks. Those kind of three, and maybe paths. You know, those types of things are the big things. And if you have a basic understanding of those, I think that, you know, if you practice, then it's pretty unlimited to what you can do.
So those are the basics. Everyone should acquire a certain amount of knowledge of those things. That simply helps you to get a little bit further, to get more out of it overall.
And I'm probably because you started on the computer, right?
Yeah.
And I started on a drafting board, on a drafting table. So my understanding of layers came from pin-registered artwork, because that's where the idea of layers comes from.
Right.
But
and I started with a camera. So again, that's the different perspectives that we're talking about here, where I was looking at just making that image look good on its own.
Right. And so, yeah, it's interesting to see, because we all three came from different backgrounds in a sense. I mean, ours are very related in that design is involved, but when you start, I think, on the computer, I think that's, you end up in a similar place, but it has to affect your thinking. You know, our thinking, obviously we're different people, so our thinking's not the same to start with, but it has to be probably even more different. That's probably not grammatically correct, but different in a bigger way.
Yeah, understood. You do see a lot of the crazy stuff out there that people do, which they're happy to do, you know, and they're very excited about sort of the possibilities. I tend to cringe a little bit at some of that stuff, because I think that's where the tool kind of gets in the way and takes over, you know.
Well, I think that there's a couple philosophies. I mean, there's the stuff that, my favorite Photoshop is the stuff that you can't tell anyone used Photoshop on it. But it also doesn't, you know, it can't have existed in real life. You know what I mean? Like, there's stuff that, a photograph that you look at and you know there's no way to actually photograph that, but it looks completely real and you can't figure out how they did it. That's my favorite kind of thing. But there's all sorts. I mean, there's photos that you can look at and be, you know, not ever think that anyone even used Photoshop on it, and, you know, it's not overdone or anything like that.
But completely created.
Right.
To the point where there may not even be technically a camera-created image in it. Right. As far as that goes, really CG generated, computer generated, not camera generated.
Or it could be. I know for me, it's like I like those images that do look like photographs. You know, obviously, we've seen many, many, many that are beautifully done, but I also like a piece where Photoshop has been used, where it just looks like art. You know, and you don't think about whether it's Photoshop or not Photoshop, but it looks like art.
It really doesn't matter sort of what it was in the end, but it's exciting.
Doesn't matter what was used to get to that end product, you know, that creation. But you just, it's a nice piece, no matter what. On its own. You know,
great. Well, that's a nice way to end this. Joan, Terry, Pete Chilton, thanks very much for being part of this Art Talk after the Art Walk. Again, I'm Tom Prutisto. This has been a lot of fun. Don't forget to stop in to see the art that's here on display at Amherst Media and all the other venues that are out there. So long till the next Art Talk. Thanks.